This one is personal to me because this album, Stryper in God We Trust, this exact album was the first Christian metal album I ever owned. I was 11. And 11 perhaps is an age when music doesn't just sound good, it affects you. It becomes a sound that you can return to. And I've listened to it through many different seasons of my life. But here's the question. What if the album isn't just riffs and high vocals and nostalgia, but what if it's trying to build a type of Christianity inside the listener? So today, we're going to do a track by track look at Stryper's In God We Trust. And we're not going to quote the lyrics really, but to map the theology that's under all that gloss and glamour. It's an album really that becomes multi-layered and complex. It's a set of colors, lots of them are yellow and black, and it can encourage the idea of smells and produce this private grammar inside a person that stirs real feelings. And if you grew up like I did, anywhere near evangelical culture or anywhere near Christian record stores or bookshops or youth groups or cassette racks, then you know exactly what I mean when you say that this wasn't just an album. This work of music was an argument, a mission, a dare, a poster on the wall that said, oh yes, we can do this too. And today I want to do something a little bit different because this album has a theological arc, but the songs also sit as individual themes. And I want to look inside Stryper's In God We Trust, the 1988 album, and listen to what the lyrics are actually doing. I don't want to look at just what they say, but what they assume about the listener, what they fear and what they want, and what they really think that the Christian life is all about. And I want to ask an even bigger question. I want to ask, what kind of Christianity is this album trying to build inside you? I just want to do a quick note, really, because I should, or because I have to. I'm not going to read you the full lyrics because in the world we live in today, copyright is real. And I'll be honest with you, I love Stryper still, and I don't want to make them mad. But I will summarize the lyrics and I'll synthesize them and I'll quote perhaps short fragments where it's needed and where it helps us learn. And hopefully I'll give you a sort of thematic map that means you can return to the album and have a listen. And by the end, I want us all to feel like we've walked through the whole record. We've done it track by track, but also like we've seen the whole blueprint of the idea of what the album actually is. Okay, let's go. The phrase "In God We Trust" is printed on American money, which is either funny or terrifying, depending on your mood, because money doesn't just sit in your wallet or leave your wallet at great pace. Money is theological. It tells you what's solid, what's safe, and what will still be there when the floor drops out of your world. So when Stryper made an album named In God We Trust, they're not just quoting a slogan. I think perhaps they're picking a fight. And the cover tells you that immediately. We've got this torn paper effect, like something has been ripped open. We've got a kind of national imagery, and we've got language of America and currency and trust and public faith. And then we have this centerpiece. We have Stryper in big yellow and black, and it's loud and it's unavoidable. And underneath that, quietly but sharply, there's a Bible verse, Isaiah 53, verse 5. The verse itself is about wounds and about healing through suffering, about the cost of salvation, and about someone being pierced. So notice the clash in the imagery, the public slogan of trust and the private ache for redemption. This is an album that looks patriotic and then quietly hangs a crucified theology underneath that patriotism. And this is not an accident. 1988 is late 80s hard rock territory with big choruses, glossy production, guitar tone that shines and shimmers, and drums that punch like advertising. And Stryper are doing something very specific here. They want this album, I think, to be accessible, not one of those niche albums. Perhaps the Gethsemane Rose album is more niche that we looked at the other day. But this album's not hidden. It's not um, specifically Christian music, but I think you can tell that it is also Christian music, but they want to sound like a band that belongs on the same shelf as the mainstream and then smuggle in explicit Christian claims. And I think that maybe is the Stryper project in one sentence, or certainly, Stryper 1.0 up until 1991. And in my mind, they are the band that succeed the most at this. But it is fair to say they are not and were not everyone's cup of tea. Because here's the thing, when you try to stand with one foot in the mainstream and one foot in explicit evangelism, you feel pressure not from one side, but from both sides. From the outside, you're too religious. And from the inside, you can be accused of being too worldly. And that's to say nothing of Christians who just think heavy music is demonic. So a lot of what you hear on this album and lyrically is this pressure management. It's the reassurance and the urgency and the boundary marking. And it's the argument for don't drift and the urgency to choose now and to stay loyal and keep that fire burning. This isn't a relaxed form of Christianity. This is Christianity trying to survive success without dissolving into not Christianity. And honestly, that part is why it's great. Because it's not just preaching, it's the sound of a movement trying to keep its real shape. Before we go any further, we should talk about who Stryper are in the story of Christian music. Because whatever else you think of them, unlike lots of things I enjoy researching, they are not this obscure footnote. They're one of the most, if not the most, commercially successful Christian rock and metal band acts ever. And perhaps I think this is true, that they were the first openly Christian metal bands to break into the mainstream in a way that forced people to pay attention. And the proof is simple. To Hell with the Devil album goes platinum. A Christian metal album goes platinum. Now that success comes with baggage because Stryper didn't turn up looking like choir boys. They turn up with hairspray and spandex and makeup and stripes and this whole Sunset Strip vocabulary. And then they start singing. And they're singing about Jesus. So they end up controversial in both directions. From the secular side, there's the accusation that you're preaching. And from the Christian side, you look like the world and heavy music is demonic. And then there's the stuff that becomes legend and valuable on eBay. They literally throw Bibles into the crowd, actual Bibles with their logo on. And To Hell with the Devil, even the cover becomes this drama. The original artwork has these angelic figures with faces of the band members throwing the devil down. And Christian retailers reportedly pushed back hard enough that the label removed it and made it a plain black cover. So, yeah, they're family friendly. And my kids from a young age have been listening to this album and other Stryper albums because I've made them. In fairness, when my oldest had colic, it was Stryper live album with all that background white noise that made her sleep. So even when I put this on today, she feels that nostalgia of being absolutely tiny, and it feels familiar. So yeah, they're family friendly, but they're also basically doing Christian provocation, but not for unfair reasons, but perhaps as a method of ministry. And then they split and they go quiet for a while and later reform. And the key point for this episode is that they don't come back as a nostalgia act. They keep making records, they create new music. And the later era is often leans much heavier, not just musically, but in themes as well. There's more talk of evil and judgment and spiritual conflict. And there's this whole final battle language. That apocalyptic edge shows up more explicitly than it did in the glossy 80s phase. Maybe one day I'll look at one of the newer albums on this channel at some point. But all this means is that Stryper remain what they always were. They're a band that refuse to be easily filed away into neat categories. And that's why In God We Trust is worth reading closely, because it isn't just music. It's a theology trying to survive in the public space. And before we go track by track, I think it's important that we look and name and acknowledge some of the big themes that we will keep hearing. There's the theme of trust versus money. This album is suspect of wealth and it treats money like a rival god. And then there's this concept of urgency versus delay. It seems obsessed with tomorrow, the idea that you can always decide later. And actually, this album calls that a lie. And then there's this idea of perseverance versus cooling off, where faith is pictured like a fire. And if you don't stop feeding the fire, then it dies. It has love language that works two ways, because some songs sound like they're addressed to a person, but they function like they're addressed to God or to the listener as God's beloved. This ambiguity is not an error. It seems a clear strategy. And there's this tension between kingship and celebrity. The album critiques fame and greed and status, and then tries to redirect that desire towards Christ as king. So the album is basically doing this. It's trying to take all the things that late 80s rock promised you, the success and love, belonging, glory and permanence, and then reattach those back on to God. And that's the synthesis of the album. Now let's walk through song by song. In God We Trust, the title track is blunt. It sets up money as something that speaks to you, not just something you spend, but it talks and it makes you promises. It offers you security, and the song pushes back. This is not subtle. It's basically the album's statement and its thesis. It says you have to trust something. We all trust something. And if you trust money, it will betray you. Now, here's what's interesting. The song doesn't just say love God. It says your belief is visible in what you rely on when you're afraid. I think that could be a very mature spiritual point, actually. But it isn't always said on this album maturely. But the point itself is strong, because you can say all sorts of things. You can sing all sorts of things. But where does your trust go when your ground shakes? And that's the real theology. At 11, my experience of money was limited. It was trying to get enough money to buy the next album. But now I'm 48. That makes sense. They present a world with clean lines. It's Matthew 7 and Luke 6, and God is the rock and money is the sand. It's simple. And at 11, I liked simple. But now let me add an adult observation. The track is not merely anti materialism, it also has an anti anxiety attached to it because money is often not loved for itself. It's loved as a form of protection and as safety. So when the song says, don't trust money, what it's really saying is don't build your sense of safety on something that can evaporate. And that's a pastoral move, isn't it? And it sets up the rest of the album as a kind of discipleship manual. Now we hit one of the album's most famous dynamics, the power ballad. And this is where Stryper always do and always did something fantastic. Because the language is relational and tender and comforting and promises this presence. And you can hear and read it two ways. Is it a song to a person, or you can see it as a song with the language of God implied? That two way of reading it is part of why it crossed over, because a secular listener can hear it as romance, and a Christian listener can hear it as devotion. And the band don't have to choose. Now, we could ask, is that manipulative? And the answer is probably, maybe. But it's also genuinely how religious love works, because the Christian tradition has always had love language and it flows. And think of the Psalms and medieval devotion and Jesus is my beloved, and think of hymns that sound like wedding vows. You don't have to love them. I mean, you can, or you cannot, it's up to you. But we must admit that they exist, and they've existed for a long time. Stryper aren't inventing that. They're translating it into 1980s rock. So Always There for You becomes a theology of presence. And here I think is the key. This album is not only warning you, it's trying to hold you, and it's holding you tightly and permanently, because warning without comfort can easily become despair. And also, comfort without warning becomes this meaningless emotional mush. So the album alternates. The opening track is a warning, and the next one is an embrace. And that rhythm seems to continue through the whole of the record. Keep the Fire Burning is perhaps the discipleship anthem. Faith is pictured as something that must be kept alive, and it's not assumed, and it's not inherited, and it's definitely not just sat on the shelf. It's active. And again, that fits into late 80s evangelical mood, because evangelicalism, especially the youth culture version, often frames faith even today as intensity, that hot is real and cold is danger. Now, there is a strength here. It's about human drift, because people cool off. There's warnings in Revelation. Losing your first love, people fade, they get tired, they compromise. And people slowly stop believing without noticing. Keep the Fire Burning is like this preventative sermon, but there's also, like with so much of this album, there's a weakness, because if you frame faith mainly as temperature, you can end up terrified of the seasons in your life that are normal, because maybe sadness can be coldness, and exhaustion can become backsliding, and depression becomes a lack of fire. These are things which I've heard thrown at me and others in recent months and years, and they don't have to be true. Sometimes life is just normal. So as an adult, I hear the above, but as a kid, I heard the same songs and I felt something else. It made faith feel like strength, and you could do it, and like you had freedom, and like determination could help, and that Christianity was not just a label, but it was a thing you could choose every day. It encouraged a seriousness of faith. And maybe that's why these kind of songs actually work. Another devotional shaped song is I Believe in You. And Again, you can read this romantically, but it can also function as a testimony. And the phrase, I believe in you, is interesting because Christian language is usually more, I believe in God. And to a person, you normally say, I believe you, or I believe in us, or I trust you. So when the song says, I believe in you, it's turning this personal devotion into a creedal language. It's like a love song and a confession of faith fused together. And that fusion seems part of Stryper's whole method. They take the emotional engine of pop and rock music, of longing and loyalty, devotion, and they redirect it towards Christian commitment. I think that probably feels like the project. Now, do they always do it with nuance? No, because you've got 3, 4, 5 minutes of the song, but they do it always with conviction. And that is key because conviction is a kind of beauty in music. Even when we disagree with that conviction, it's still a beauty in that music. The Writings on the Wall is the urgency track. It's about decision, about not waiting, about the danger of later. And you can hear that sort of evangelistic logic. If you keep pushing faith into the future, you never have to change now. Tomorrow can become that hiding place. So the song tries to remove the veiling and the hiding place. And the theme runs across of really a lot of evangelical preaching. The fear of delay, not because Christianity is impatient necessarily, although you hear some people and you wonder if that might be the case, but because it knows how humans work. We can always postpone transformation and it can ruin things. We can always say, once life settles down, once I'm older, once I've had my fun, or once I'm less tired, or once I fix this one thing. A lot of it feels like rural English Anglicanism to me, because people move to the villages as they retire and they begin to find faith. And this is a good and a bad thing. It's good for those that do find faith. But what if they don't make it that far? What if that avoidance becomes permanent? And the Writings on the Wall attacks that. It's basically the truth is already in front of you, and stop pretending you can outsmart time. Now, if you grew up with altar calls, then this is the track that feels most familiar. It has that same emotional architecture. You're at the crossroads. The choice is yours. Don't walk away. And musically, it's built to feel like this rush of inevitability. And I think this is Stryper and In God We Trust doing a form of revivalism. It's Up to You is basically an agency anthem. It's your choice. And this is where Stryper show you something deep about their theology. And again, I'm not asking you to agree with it. I'm just telling you what it looks like they're saying, because they frame salvation and discipleship in terms of this personal, individual decision. It's not fate, nor culture, nor upbringing, nor the institution. It is you. Now, in evangelicalism, as you know, I have mixed feelings about this because it can be both powerful and destructive. The power is there because it says you're not trapped, you can change, you can choose, there is hope. And it can destroy because it can imply if you fail, it's because you didn't choose hard enough. And sincerity becomes the test. So again, adult me listens to this album with 2 ears and 2 thoughts, because As a thematic piece on the album, it fits perfectly. We've had a warning, then we had comfort, then perseverance, then urgency, and now we have responsibility. Christianity is not just a feeling, it's a decision that reshapes the self. And that is what this track seems to be doing. The world of you and I is one of the most interesting moments of the record, I think, because it leans into a kind of relational universe, a world that is made of two people, you and I, or by God and the believer, or by the believer and their beloved. And again, the ambiguity speaks loudly. What Stryper are doing across this album is constructing a Christian emotional life that can compete with mainstream romantic longing. Because mainstream pop and rock says that love will save you and it will complete you and love will last forever and love will make a world. And Stryper respond, yes, but not how you think, not in the end. So they take the same emotional architecture again and they make it holy. And this track is doing that. It's sort of remapping this longing into holy longing. Come to the Everlife is next. And now we get this direct invitation. And I do love the phrase. It's played on my mind a lot, Everlife, because it's slightly odd English. It's perhaps a little bit youth groupy and slightly, we need a term that sounds big. But I think it does something clever. It makes eternal life sounds like a place you can enter, not just a doctrine that you aspire to. It's experiential language. It's the language of new life, a new heart and peace and a future. And this track is important because it stops the album becoming only about fear and discipline. Because if all you have is don't trust money and don't wait and don't cool off and choose now and try harder, then faith can become this exhausting treadmill. And this song says, no, this is about being given life. And it is a necessary counterbalance to the rest of the album. The track Lonely does matter because it admits what a lot of Christian triumphalism, particularly in the 1980s, tried and tries to deny. It says that you can be a believer and still feel empty, you can still feel abandoned, you can still feel lonely. And this track matters to me and has mattered to me at times of difficulty. And even if the track resolves in the end towards hope, which it does, the fact it starts in that place is important because loneliness is one of those great spiritual pressures that we deal with by ourselves. It makes you look for substitutes, and the substitutes, you can look at money and you can look for sex and status and noise and busyness and frankly anything that fills that void. So when the album includes Lonely, again, it's doing pastoral realism and it's saying, yes, we're going to talk about greed and glory and decision, but we're also going to talk about the actual pain and ache that make people reach for those counterfeit gods. That is the logic of this song. And then the album ends like all Christian things should end, with the great hope of the kingdom of Christ. And we have the song The Rain, it's the final track. And the ending tells you what the album thinks is sort of the ultimate. This track, I think, critiques the late 80s dream of cars, mansions, and planes, and the fantasy of having it all. And it reframes history as something moving towards a specific certain day, this day of reckoning, a day when the world realizes it trusted the wrong things. Then it turns the listener's desire towards a different center the reign of Christ, the King of Kings, the one who reigns over all. So the album ends where it began. It ends and begins with trust. But now that trust is not about money, it's about glory. It's about what do you worship and what do you imagine as the good life and what story do you think you're in? Stryper say, not the story of fame, not the story of wealth, and not the story of endless youth, but you are in a kingdom story. And that is a strong ending because it lets the album be more than personal salvation. It gestures towards a world renewed and a world made new by Christ the King. Now, step back. What have we just explored and listened to? We've listened to the concepts in the album that tries to form 5 things in us. The hearer, a distrust of money as our ultimate security, an urgency about conversion and decision, and discipline in the work of sustaining faith, and this emotional belonging through devotion-shaped love songs, and then a critique of fame and an appeal to Christ's kingship. I think if we were to put that differently, this album is building an evangelical self, a self who is always individually deciding, always recommitting, always refusing idols, always trying to stay hot and trying not to drift. And again, let's ask an adult question. Is that healthy? Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. Because what it does brilliantly is give you clarity. But what it can struggle with is patience. Christianity is also seasonal because Christianity is also boredom. Christianity is chronic pain, and it's also depression, and it's also waiting, and it's also being faithful when you feel nothing. And Stryper, because they're writing in this late 80s revivalist youth culture, tend to speak in the language of heat and urgency. That's not wrong. It's just partisan. And I think we probably should admit that. And that's why this album is so revealing. It's not a set of songs, it is a snapshot of a spiritual mood. It's a time when Christian rock is trying to be mainstream without losing its evangelistic nerve. And it's a time when success feels like temptation. So the album repeatedly says, don't sell your soul and don't drift, don't delay, don't worship me and don't worship fame. And under that, you can hear the fear in the listener and the fear in the band. What if we do? Let's return to that little line of Isaiah 53, verse 5, because it's easy to miss. And in their next album, it disappears from the front cover. But it changes how we should read the whole In God We Trust project. Because Isaiah 53 is not triumphal. It is suffering and affliction. It's wounds and it's healing through being pierced. So on the record that sometimes feels like victory music, Isaiah 53 verse 5 is like this quiet anchor, because the center of Christianity is not success. It is the sacrifice found in Isaiah 53. And that's important because a band like Stryper could easily have leaned into this pure triumph because they're in the arena and they're in the glossy production world and they're throwing Bibles into the crowd and they're doing these big choruses. And yet the reference signals we're not preaching self-esteem, we're preaching a wounded healer. And that visually becomes the theological spine by which we can listen to these songs. And even when the lyrics are simple, that reference can be doing deep work in us. Now, I want to talk about the album as an object because part of why it mattered, especially to an 11-year-old me, was it was physical. We had the art and the fonts and the colors and the big yellow and black logo, and you had the feel of it. You can hold it. And if you have the picture disc version of the record, like I do, then it was even more of a special thing. The late 80s evangelical ecosystem loved this because it let Christian identity feel not embarrassing. And that matters more than people care to admit, because if you're a kid or a teenager and your faith feels socially fragile and unpopular, then this album says you can be Christian and you can still have something that feels powerful. The guitars are not sorry. The logo isn't shy. And the whole thing is full of confidence by design. And that's part of Stryper's ministry. It's not just the words, it's the aesthetic. In a world of streaming today, this can easily be forgotten. I think in the end, we need to admit that Stryper were writing for two audiences at one time. Firstly, there's the believer who needed motivation. And secondly, there's the listener who is not yet a believer, but is within reach. And that's why this album keeps toggling between reassurance songs of I'm here and I believe in you and always there, and then the warning songs of don't wait, it's up to you, trust God, not money. And that toggle is an evangelistic design, because it means if you're already in, you can feel strengthened, and if you're on the edge, you can feel cooled. So the album functions like a sermon series. It's like week 1, idols; 2, comfort; perseverance; 4, commitment; then urgency; then decision; then belonging; then invitation; then honest pain; and then the kingdom. This album is brilliantly structured. But let me end where I began. I was 11 and I didn't have a sophisticated theology. I didn't have a clean worldview and I didn't have an adult critique. What I did have was this: a sense that Christianity could be loud and that it could be confident and it could be beautiful in a way that wasn't trying to be cute. And the lyrics, even though they were blunt, can give people like me when I was 11 a map. Trust God, don't trust money, don't delay, don't drift, come to life, hold on, you're not alone, a king is coming. This is a coherent spiritual world. And if you're a kid, coherence, even though you might not grasp why, can feel comforting. So whatever you think of Stryper, whatever you think of late 80s Christian rock, this album did something real for a lot of people. It gave them a language for faith that sounded like power and meant something like surrender. And that mixture of power and surrender is basically the Christian paradox in hard rock, amplifier, guitar, drums, bass, high vocal form. Because there are many ways to preach. And this album preaches with distortion. If you enjoyed this video, then please like it and subscribe to the channel, because this channel is basically history, theology, and then the weird places that they hide. And today, that includes inside the glossy machinery of 80s Christian metal. God bless.